Okay, let's talk about the materials we need for getting started with watercolor. The first thing you need is good watercolor paper. It has to be 100% cotton or cotton rag. And it's probably the most, it's not probably, it is the most important part of your materials. If you have subpar watercolor paper, you're not going to be very happy with your watercolors, and your experience is not going to be all that great because you're going to be so frustrated. So please do yourself a big favor and buy good watercolor paper. And the brand I prefer is Arches, or correctly pronounced, because it's French, is Arche, but here in the United States of America, we say Arches, so that's what I'm going to call it. And the cold pressed, that's the one that's the easiest to deal with and probably the most commonly used because it's an all-round paper. It's great for any subject matter, I would say. You can also get it in hot pressed. That means it's very, very smooth, and I would definitely not suggest that. That is best for architectural renderings or, you know, botanical renderings, that kind of stuff, where you don't paint with a lot of water, you paint with small brushes, and it's very precise. That's not what I'm going to be teaching you because that's not how I paint. So cold pressed Arches watercolor paper. And then the weight, 300 grams, or here in the States we call it 140 pounds. And that is what you need to find. So you can find it either in blocks. This one happens to be a square block. I would actually suggest, if you can find it, get a block that is like this size, 8 by 10, because that's a standard size in watercolor paintings. And so when you go and need a mat and a frame, you don't have to get it custom made. And that makes a huge difference in the price. And I can just tell you from my experience, the minute you paint on something odd size, that's going to turn out fantastic. And you really want to frame it, and you have a heart attack when you hear what that's going to cost. Just saying, my own experience. So if you can find blocks, that's great. Or otherwise you buy it in full sheets, it's called. You can buy them individually if you buy it from an art supply store. And a sheet here in the States would cost you anywhere between $7 and $11, I would say. And it's expensive, but it's worth it. And remember, a big sheet's 22 inches by 30 inches. So you get 6 pieces of these 8 by 10, and then you get some extra pieces where you can either use it as scrap paper to test out colors and techniques on, or you can make it into bookmarks, or you can make it into little miniature paintings, so nothing goes to waste. So that is the paper, and then we need to paint with some brushes, of course. And I would suggest that if you're living in the United States of America, you can get a set of 8 brushes that will cover the gamut of what you will ever need in a set like this. They're called Mimic Squirrel, animal-friendly, high performance watercolor brushes, and I love them. I've been using them for the last 3-4 years, and they are just excellent brushes. And the beauty is, the set like this, it's right around $30 most of the time. And you can also get a smaller set where there's, I think, 4 or 5 brushes in that you could get if you're on a tight budget. But otherwise, get a set like this and you're set for any size you might need. And then there's one additional brush that I would suggest you get, and that is this one here. It's a 1/2-inch dagger brush. It's my absolute favorite brush. I've been painting with this brush as long as I've been painting, pretty much. As soon as I got introduced to this brush by a former instructor, I have not let this out of my paint kit. I love it. You could even pretty much do any painting with just this brush, not like if you're painting huge, but what we're going to be doing, which is mainly 8 by 10. 1/2-inch dagger brush, and then this, and you're set on brushes. It's all in the material list, so you can find it there, including links. So we need colors, of course, and we need a palette to hold our colors in. My favorite palette is this one here. It's the Travel Palette by Jane E. Jones, and it has a lid, which I would strongly suggest you get a palette that has a lid, because you don't want all sorts of things to get in your colors. And since watercolors are expensive, we don't want to waste them. And they don't go bad, so when they dry up in the wells here, you just give them a little water and voila, they're good to go again. So this palette has room for 12 colors here, and that's what I set my palettes up with 12 colors. But you don't need to set up with 12 to begin with if you're just starting out. That's going to be expensive if you buy 12 tubes of color in one go. And it's enough to start out with 3 3, and I'm gonna go over which 3 you should buy, and then you can add on. And in the lid here, you can see you also have 4 extra mixing areas, and you have all these little areas here where you can also mix, and then the big round in here. I love this palette. It's small enough that I can travel with it, and it's excellent also for the studio. I find the wells are excellent. Even with a big brush, you can get in there and get your pigment out, mix it around, and you're not damaging your brush by trying to get into little wincy small little wells. Some palettes, and I'm just going to show you here, I have a little travel palette, and this one I use for if I'm out on a hike or I'm traveling. Then I use a little travel palette like this, and this one is called the Portable Painter. I'll list it on the material list just so you can see it, if that happens to be something you're interested in. So it has 12 wells here, and they're little half pans, they're called. So there's those little square pans. And this one here came empty, and then you fill them up yourself with your tubes. And that's how I prefer to do it. But I'm not a big fan of having a palette, you know, for my studio painting with these tiny little things, because can you imagine how annoying this would be? Yeah, you can imagine that, I think, even if you haven't painted before. So anyway, that's my little travel palette, and it's very practical. It goes like this, and then you can put water in those 2 containers, and there's this little gadget here so it keeps it together, and then there's a little rubber band, and then you could have your brush or your pencil or your pen or whatever tucked in here. I tuck this one in because I always like to have a color guide on my palette. But that was a little side note. That's, you know, a travel palette. But I would suggest you get tubes of paint and get artist grade, not student grade. When you get student grade, what happens is when you're painting, then your colors won't go really, really dark, and they won't go all that bright. They'll be more pale, because to make it economical, they have to put more filler in, and that means you get less pigment. So in the end, you're not getting more paint. You're just getting more volume if you buy student grade. So that's that on the palette and the first part of the paint, because now we come to the fun part, the colors. I love color, and it's very hard to limit yourself. But if you are brand spanking new, I would suggest you start out with just the 3 primary colors, and that is red, it is blue, and it is yellow. Red, blue, and yellow. I would definitely go with this yellow here, transparent yellow, or if you got, that's Winsor Newton, or if you buy it in the Daniel Smith brand, they call it Nichols Azo yellow. So it's the same exact pigment, same color yellow, but it has different names, and that's what you will find very often in the different brands. There are many good brands out there, and it depends on where you live what would be the most economical for you. And you'll find that sometimes different brands call the same color different names. Makes it very confusing, but don't worry, I'll guide you through that as we go. So that would be my yellow, no matter what red and blue I decided on. If I wanted to go more traditional, I would go with French ultramarine blue as my one blue, and I would go with the quinacridone coral as my red. That's one option. I could also decide that I don't want to go with this red. I will go with permanent rose instead. That's a pinker red, but that would still work out really, really well as your one red when you start out. And we'll get into the colors once we start, you know, painting. But I just wanted to let you know. And then the other thing, you could leave this one in, and you could decide if you wanted to that instead of that French ultramarine blue, you would rather have this one, primary blue cyan. This is a more modern take on the primary colors. This, together with the yellow, would be what you see in your printers, your dot printers. And we're going to go into that. We're going to do an exercise where we compare the different ways of looking at the 3 primary colors. But basically, primary colors is 1 blue, 1 red, and 1 yellow. Now, if you're on a budget, start with that. Just the 3 colors. And after you've looked at my exercise where I go through the 2 different variations of primary colors, you can decide which way you want to go. Now, if you had a little bit of a bigger budget and you could afford to have 2 reds, well, then I would add this quinacridone coral red back in again. Then I have a more fire engine red, and then a pink red, and then I would add my blue back in again here, the French ultramarine blue, because then I have a more turquoisey blue, and then I have a more warm purpley blue. And then we have the yellow, and instead of adding on, I could add on a second yellow that would be warmer. This one would be cooler, but instead of going with a warm and a cool yellow, I would instead jump over and do a burnt sienna, or you could, and that's from Winsor Newton, or you could also go with the quinacridone burnt orange if you wanted to go with Daniel Smith, because that is like an orangey brown, and it will be a wonderful addition to these 5 other colors. That's what I would go with. And this would be a very, very good starting palette with these 6 colors. So why don't we put these 6 colors out? First, we're going to be starting with just painting with 3 colors, the 3 primary colors, and we're going to try out the 2 different combinations, 2 or 3 different combinations actually, and then we're going to expand our palette to the 6 colors, and I'll show you how far you get with those. So here you see, these are the 12 colors I plan on filling my palette with. That's if you have your palette built out with 12 colors. But as we already talked about, if you're new to watercolor, I would not suggest you start out with 12 colors. It's too many, both because it gets really expensive. Each tube, this size here, they can be between $10 and $15 is kind of like the going rate. So that's a big chunk if you have to get them all in one go. And I don't think it's a good idea anyway, even if money doesn't matter to you. I would start out with 3 or max 6 colors. So I laid them out like this because I like to have them in the order of the color wheel. So I have my yellows moving over to my blues, to my reds, and then we're back to the yellow. And the first 3 colors I think you should invest in is either go with the quinacridone coral, that's from Daniel Smith, and squeeze out a good amount. Don't be stingy, they don't go bad. When they dry, you just spray some water on. When they dry, you just spray some water on, and they're good to go again. So that's different than any other, medium that you have, like oils or acrylics. So that was my red. My yellow that I would choose, no matter which way I would go with my red and my blue, is definitely this one here, which is transparent yellow. And don't be alarmed, it does not look very pretty when it's squeezed out and it's wet and concentrated. That is because it is truly a transparent yellow, and so it doesn't look as pretty as some of the other yellows where they have white in them. But I don't want white in my yellow. So that was my yellow. And then if we go traditional, we would go with our French ultramarine blue, which is this one here. Squeeze that out. Such a beautiful blue. You can see it's leaning a little tiny bit to the purple side. So that would be my 3 colors. And if I wanted to go with a couple extra colors, the next color I would choose for the reds would be my permanent rose. And you could also go for the permanent rose as your first red. We'll talk more about that when we start painting and when we go into the colors a little bit more in depth. So you can see here, this is what the quinacridone coral looks like. This is what the permanent rose looks like. So you can see this is more pink, this is more true red. And then the yellow, it's this yellow here. Nickel Azo yellow, or the one I happen to have there is transparent yellow, but it's the same color and pigment, so they look pretty much identical. So it's a beautiful yellow, and it's truly transparent. You can see the reason I have the black lines here, we talk more about that later, but is so that when I paint over them, I can see how transparent or opaque a color is. So you can see this yellow is truly transparent. And here's the French ultramarine blue, and you can see how beautiful that is. And then if you didn't want to go with the French ultramarine blue, or if you wanted to splurge and have 2 blues to start out, the other blue I would go for is this one, a primary blue cyan. And that's again more if you wanted, and the pink is more like if you wanted to go with what the printers do. So here's the primary blue cyan, and this one is from My Mary Blue, and I think it's an Italian company if I'm not mistaken. So it's a little bit more of an oddball, but it's the prettiest I found out there in the watercolor world, and it's this one here. So can you see the difference between French ultramarine blue and the primary blue cyan? You can see this is more like turquoise, so it's leaning more towards the yellow side, and this one is a little bit more violet, leans a little bit more towards the purple side. So then you could stop here if you wanted to, and you would be fine. And then if you were going to add one more color, I would most likely, instead of going with the new gamboge, which would be the natural choice because, you know, you have 2 blues, 2 reds, and then you would go for 2 yellows. But I find that you do better, you get a better variety if instead of the yellow, which I'm going to choose new gamboge, I would go with the burnt sienna, which is this one here. So you can see it's an orangey brown. And as we start painting, you'll see why I made that choice. Here's the burnt sienna, and I can tell you already now is that burnt sienna and the French ultramarine blue, they make the most glorious grays and browns and neutrals. And if you mix it with the primary blue, you actually get like really deep forest green, more muted greens. Whereas if you use the yellow, of course, you get very bright greens if you use the primary blue. And if you use the yellow with the French ultramarine blue, you also get more muted greens, but, you know, different shades. So there I would have those 6 colors. And if you are going to stop there, or if you're going to stop with a blue, a red, and a yellow, make sure you leave the spaces in between so that you can continue building out your palette and you will have it in the order of the color wheel, which I find most practical. Of course, you can put your colors wherever you want, but if you want to follow along with me, I think it's a good idea if you kind of follow the same system. And that is a pretty recognized system, is just following the color wheel. And we'll talk more about that. Now, the next color I would get, if I then wanted to spring for yet another color, I would probably go with the cobalt blue, which is such a great blue for also grays and browns and also skies, and just in general it's just a wonderful blue. And you can see it's quite different, it's in between, you could say, and then it's a lighter blue, it doesn't go real dark. That's why I would not go with that one as my only blue, because then I really would get in trouble when I'm trying to mix some dark colors. That's why I go with French ultramarine blue. But can you see how this is like more purpley, this is more turquoisey, and then this one's more true blue, but it's just a lighter version. So let's squeeze that out, and that would then go here, and good squeeze in. Again, don't be stingy, don't do just like a little tiny dab, that's pointless. And the next color I would go for is probably this one here, permanent magenta. It would be a toss-up between permanent magenta and indigo. So you can see I do have an overload of the blue colors. That just seems to work best for me. And here is the permanent magenta. So what I mean is, don't do like that, because then once you start painting, and then you're going to run out pretty soon, even though they do go far, and then you have to stop everything you're doing and go dig out your tube of paint and then squeeze it in. And by that time, things on your watercolor paper have dried, and that wasn't really a good idea, and stuff like that. You'll know once you start painting, you'll know what I'm talking about. Now you just have to trust me. So here's the permanent magenta, and it looks like this. So it's a reddish purple, I would say, so kind of burgundy color. And the reason I like to have it is, it, you know, is a beautiful color just on its own, and you can push it in different directions by adding blue or by adding red or the permanent rose. And if you add a little bit of yellow, you actually get some lovely browns, and we'll get into that as we go along. And another reason I like to have it is a wonderful color as a shadow color when you are painting, for instance, red flowers, because that can be difficult to get a good shadow color and not have it go brown on you or too purple. And then the next color I would choose would actually be my indigo. Indigo is this color here, very rich, dark, super dark, almost black, blackish blue. This one is from Winsor Newton. Indigo from other brands, they look a little bit different, they have a bit different color combination. This, let me just see that I'm telling the truth here, this is the only color except for Opera Rose. These two are the two only colors on my palette that has more than one pigment in them. So anyway, I prefer this indigo. I'm used to working with it, and it works fantastic together with the burnt sienna from Winsor Newton. This is also Winsor Newton. They create also fantastic evergreen colors, like dark, rich greens. And then this is also great for, you know, dark, wintry skies and things like that. Has a lot of good uses. And I like the indigo from Winsor Newton the best. So here, good amount of paint. There we go. And then my next color that I would choose, probably, it's really these 3 last ones. Those are kind of fun colors in my book. You can totally live without them. But I love a good Opera Rose. It's this super bright pink. And it's just really fun, especially in florals. So I love that. If you're not a pink person, person, you might decide that you would rather have another color on your palette than the Opera Rose. But since that's one of the last colors that we add, you know, you can leave your options open, and then you can see as you develop as a painter, you know, what would appeal to you. And you have already noticed probably that I do not have greens on my palette. I'm not a fan of green on my palette. Not that there's anything wrong with it, but I think mixing your own greens give you so much better results. So anyway, today I'll go for Opera Rose, and I need to buy more. And it's important, by the way, this Opera Rose that I have here, that is from Holbein. And I have done a window test of all the Opera Roses that I have, which is a lot of the ones that are out there, because it does have a reputation of being fugitive, meaning that it, you know, it's not all that stable in the sense if you expose it to light, it will fade. And I found out by doing a test where I let it sit in a sunny window, south window, for a number of months, and the Holbein had barely any fading, and the other brands had fading going on. So that's why. And then I would probably go for the New Gamboge. And this one is from Daniel Smith. The one from Winsor Newton I do not like because they changed the formula and it doesn't look like New Gamboge at all. It looks like something else. I can't remember what that is, but it's not something I want on my palette. This is a beautiful, beautiful, warm yellow. And it does have some white in it, so it's not as transparent as my transparent yellow or my Nichols yellow. But for instance, you know, crocus, the flower, there's a yellow variety and they have exactly that color. And it's very difficult to mix this particular yellow, I find. So that's why I like to have it. And it's just nice to have another yellow on the palette. And then finally, this is my real fun color. And that is this one here, a cobalt teal. And this one is from M. Graham. That's the one, I have several of the teal colors from different brands. And this one is my absolute favorite. So that's getting on my palette. And that's a great color, you know, just in general, it's a beautiful color. It's very hard to open. If you have trouble opening your tubes, by the way, first I try to see if I can open it, and if I just grab a piece of tissue. And if that doesn't do it, then I stick it under the faucet, hot water, and let it run for a little bit, and that'll loosen up the pigment so you can unscrew it. So here's that. Is that glorious or what? Look at that. And once in a while you can see it here, you can see it, and there was one of the other ones where there was a little bit like that too. But here the yellow, sometimes they separate just a little bit. That's nothing to worry about. It's nothing to worry about. It's just sometimes that happens in certain colors. It happens when they're sitting in their tubes for a while. But this one's also a single pigment color. So look at that beauty. So I only have two where I have more than one pigment, and that's the Opera Rose and the Indigo, and all the others are single pigment colors. And I feel very, very happy with this palette. There's a couple of new colors on here that I didn't have if you have taken classes with me before or seen some of my videos before. So what's new on my palette? Let me point it out. The Cobalt Teal is new. New Gamboge is new. The Quinacridone Coal is fairly new. And the Primary Blue Cyan is new. Those are the new colors that I've added to my palette, and I'm very excited to explore it with you. So if you need a little bit more time before you start investing in your colors, if you haven't bought anything yet or palette, then I'd suggest watch the next couple of videos where I go in depth with the colors, so you can make a more educated choice on what colors would be right for you. And of course, I'm just telling you what I love and what works for me and my painting technique. But that's what I'm teaching you. You know, I'm not trying to teach you somebody else's painting technique. So I am just telling you what colors I like, what brushes I like, what paper I like, etc., etc. And of course, you can see videos and you can see demos and read books from other artists, and they will have different colors that they prefer and a different take on it. This is not an exact science. This is something that you develop over time, but we all have to start in a place. And so this is where we're starting when we're taking watercolor with Eva, and then you can educate yourself as you get more experienced. But I think we will have a lot of fun exploring these colors and seeing what all we can create with them.